Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be with y'all. I see quite a few names on the white names on black screens, folks that I know. So hi to all of those out there who I've interacted with over the years, and I'm glad that all of you are here. So tonight, I'm going to talk about plant defense, and I sometimes think about this as the eternal war with animals, but not just animals, also with various pathogens and microorganisms. So one thing we could ask, are plants helpless? Because, in some ways you could think they are. They're just sitting there with their roots in the ground. And you can see these vicious animals eating plants. But, the plants really aren't helpless, because when we go out into a prairie or into a forest, most of the plants are not damaged. There are not things just eating them up all the time. Plants are able to protect themselves in a fairly remarkable fashion. Now, we've learned a tremendous amount about plant defense, including one that I'm going to really highlight called chemical defense. We've learned a tremendous amount in the past few decades. There are whole books on this. There are classes taught on this. And it's hundreds, probably thousands of articles. It's a field that we've learned a huge amount about. And I want to mention a few categories of plant defense. So I'm going to, some of these I'll just mention in passing with an example or two, and others I'll talk about in more detail. Physical or mechanical plant defense, chemical defense, something called animal guard defense, or visual or escape in time. These are all very different mechanisms. There are some others, but these are some of the most important. And these defense mechanisms protect plants against a host of different things that would damage them, that are trying to get nutrition from them in one way or another. So for example, viruses. Many of you know about a variety of plant viruses. There's something like, for example, cucumber mosaic virus. There are bacteria. Anybody who's interested in grapes and wine, you've probably heard of Pierce's disease. That's caused by a bacterium. There is a protist. It's a fungal-like creature, but it's not a fungus that causes potato blight. There are fungi of various types. You've all heard of chestnut blight. That's an example of a fungus. And then there are insects and all kinds of other animals that attempt to eat plants. And so plants have to protect themselves against a variety of different creatures that would eat them. Now, the simplest defense mechanism is called physical or mechanical defense. And you're all familiar with this. You've all seen cacti and things like blackberries, and that's where there's literally something like thorns or spines or prickles. These all are technically different. Some trees are incredibly well protected. Some of the tropical palms have an amazing number of spines on them. But even things that seem very common to us, like a holly leaf, those leaves have actually evolved to protect against, in this case, certain kinds of creatures. And these are creatures that feed along the edge. We call them edge feeders. And you can do experiments. A caterpillar, which is one of these edge feeders, cannot eat the holly leaf if it has spines. But if the spines aren't there, if the spines have been cut off the edge of the leaf, a caterpillar can move down the leaf. Its mouth parts are able to get on there. Its body is able to move down the leaf and is able to effectively eat that leaf. So there are all kinds of types of physical defense. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on them. Another kind of physical defense, so that I find fascinating, we see in grasses. Grasses accumulate a mineral. Actually, it's a material called silica. Silica, as you know, is like sand. And when this accumulates in significant amounts in plant tissue, it can be very abrasive and damage the feeding structures, in other words, the mouth parts or teeth of the animals that are feeding on the plants, and can reduce the ability of the animal to digest it. And something kind of fascinating, if a plant is being eaten, in other words, if a herbivore is damaging it, in some cases that will turn on the genes or induce, we use the term induce, more silica to be put in the tissues. So by being injured, the plant makes more of this physical defense. It puts more of this in its tissues. And so it's kind of like humans, our immune system does something in response to a pathogen that's attacking us, likewise in plants. Now, I want to move on to chemical defense, but I want to pose a question when I show you this next slide. Is this really physical or chemical? And many of you guys are going to know this plant, one of our native Texas plants called bull nettles. Bull nettle is in the genus Nidoscolus. It has a weird pronunciation. You don't pronounce the C. And that's in the Euphorb family, or the spurge family, the poinsettia family. And this is just to show that some things don't fit neatly into a category. So if you look at the Nidoscolus here, the bull nettle, it has these long glass-like, these are actually silicaceous structures, and they have a toxin in them. And so if you brush up against this, these things break off in your skin, and you get injected with this toxin. And it, anybody who's ever dealt with this, you know that it burns quite a lot. This is a little electron micrograph down in the lower left corner of a different plant, and it shows a glandular hair. And so this glandular hair has a sticky, this produces sticky chemicals, and that actually traps the legs of certain little insects like aphids. And so they're trapped on the surface of the leaf, and then they'll dry up or they get exposed to predators. So, you know, it's a physical structure, but there's chemistry involved. So, you know, is it physical defense? Is it chemical defense? At the end of the day, it's both. I think I just wanted to show you that these categories can overlap sometimes. This is another one where the categories overlap. You may have heard of something called Dieffenbachia. I bet somebody in the group tonight has some Dieffenbachia plants in your house. These are members of the arum family. They're related to philodendron. And these things have in their tissues needle-like crystals of a material called calcium oxalate. These needle-like crystals are called raphids or raphids. And this is a microscopic side of one. You can see these long, narrow things, and you can't really see them with your eyes, but if you get that sap on your hands, or even worse, if you should try to eat some of that material, these puncture your cell membranes, and you can get a very serious reaction. So really moving on into the main focus on chemical defense, there are all kinds of poisonous plants. There are many, many books on poisonous plants. In some of the books that my colleagues and I at Brit have written, we've listed lots of poisonous plants in those books. And we have to keep in mind that plants are not simple. Some people think, well, plants are really simple. They don't have a nervous system. But plants are amazingly good at making various biochemical compounds. They're sophisticated biochemical factories. Some plants have more genes than we do. Humans, for example, based on some of the latest research, humans have somewhat little less than 23,000. Rice has at least 32,000 genes. So anybody who says plants are simple, I think they just don't understand. They're just specialized in different ways, and they are masters at biochemistry and can make a tremendous number of compounds. Here are some of the problems that poisonous plants in Texas can cause. Now, most of the time, these poisonous plants are not going to cause a problem because animals have evolved to avoid eating them. But if you trap animals in pastures and the animals are hungry, they will eat large amounts of poisonous plants, and then they get all kinds of conditions that are well known in the veterinary literature, things like the blind staggers or locoism or the slobbers or paralyzed tongue. I don't think any of us want ourselves or our animals to have these conditions. And these are things that are caused by plants right here in Texas. I want to give you just several examples of some poisonous plants found here. We have in north central Texas water hemlock. Some people call it cowbane. Its scientific name is Cicuta maculata, and it's in the carrot family. And in fact, the plant looks remarkably like wild carrots or Queen Anne's lace. And it's one of the most poisonous native plants in the whole northern hemisphere. It disrupts the nervous system. Some of you, there may be some folks in here who have some training in the nervous system. This is a GABA receptor antagonist, and it results in neuronal depolarization in the central nervous system. And the person develops seizures, coma, and can die within minutes. It's a very, very poisonous plant, literally one of the most poisonous things anywhere around. And among botanists, one of the cardinal rules is never eat anything in the carrot family unless you know exactly what it is, because the carrot family contains a number of very poisonous plants. So this is something that I had written in the Illustrated Flora of North Central Texas about water hemlock. I called it virulently poisonous. A single bite is reported to be sufficient to kill a human. Children have even been poisoned by whistles made from the stems. And you might think, well, is this so strange? Well, not really, because certain prescription medications, the wrong dosage can kill somebody. And it's not surprising that there are some things in nature that are very powerful. And by the way, this is the map of water hemlock, and you can see from that map that it's widespread in this general area. It's actually much more common than shows on this map, but it's widespread in north central Texas. Now, let's just talk about a few different kinds of chemical defense. And I'm mentioning several different kinds because I think you'll find these interesting. They act in fairly different ways. So I like to break chemical defense compounds up as follows. One type we can simply call toxins, and these damage the eater in some way. They may damage the eater's nervous system. They may damage the eater's digestive system. They may damage the eater in any number of ways. Another kind are known as digestibility reducers. They make the food that's eaten not worth eating. In other words, the animal can't digest that food. A third type are things that mimic hormones, that disrupt our hormone system. And some of these in particular mimic the female hormone estrogen. Another category are called semiochemicals. And that word semio is referring to something that signals. And so these are chemicals that signal the allies of the plant. In other words, they're calling on the enemies of the creature that's trying to eat the plant. And I'll explain what I mean by that. And then there are a bunch of other kinds I'll mention one called photosensitizers. Okay, now let's look at another important concept before I start talking about the different kinds of plant toxins in detail. This is the concept of induction. Plants, if they're damaged, can turn on genes. So some compounds can be induced. So the plant is damaged, and then the plant starts making toxins. Those toxins, the genes are turned on, the genes have been induced. And that's, now, some toxins are present all the time, and those are called constitutive, but plants do fight back. They're damaged, and they make more toxins. So as I say, they can be constitutive or they can be induced by herbivore damage, and hundreds or even up to several thousand genes get turned up or turned down as a result of damage by herbivores. And it's kind of astonishing. And plants, by the way, also communicate with other parts of their bodies and with nearby plants that they have been damaged. Compounds, volatile compounds are sent out in the air, and other plants can sense these, and they can turn on their defenses even though they have not been damaged themselves. So it's literally, the plants are talking in a sense. They're not using words, but they're using a chemical language. Now, let's talk a little bit about toxins. This is an article from a number of years ago. Insect feeding mobilizes a unique plant defense protease that disrupts the periotrophic matrix of caterpillars. That means when the insects eat this plant, the plant starts producing toxins that actually damage the gut of the caterpillars. So there was one way of saying this, it actually shreds the gut. It knocks holes in the gut. It leaves the gut lining in tatters. That's pretty dramatic, isn't it? Well, by the way, we know of some plants, one of which is wheat, that can damage the guts of the intestines of certain individuals. For about 2 in 100 people, wheat is literally poisonous. Those people suffer from a condition known as celiac disease, and it causes serious disruption of the digestive system, and the people suffer mightily. And there are an additional many other people that are being injured by the consumption of wheat and simply don't know it. But for a small percentage of people, wheat is actually quite dangerous. Here's a different type of toxin, glycosides. These are two-part molecules. One part is a sugar and one part is a non-sugar. And many plants store chemicals in this form. And when the plant is damaged, the form can change. So just let me mention a couple. There's one called cardiac glycosides, and these can affect the heart of animals that eat this material. Another type is called cyanogenic glycosides. When the tissue of these plants are damaged, they produce cyanide. And you've all heard of how toxic cyanide is. It's acutely toxic. So digitalis, this does not grow wild around here, even though I sometimes see it in nurseries in the spring. It's too dry, too hot and dry here for it. It's a European plant. It's escaped in some parts of the US, like in the Pacific Northwest. I believe at the beginning of the session tonight, I think somebody said they were in Oregon maybe. And if you go up into the wet parts of Washington and Oregon near the coast, you can sometimes see this foxglove escape. But this plant is very toxic. It has these cardiac glycosides, and they have actually been used medicinally. And up until recent years, these cardiac glycosides were used to treat certain heart conditions. In significant amounts, though, they actually are quite poisonous. And you may have heard of the oleander plant. They're planted in this area, even though they're a little marginal in terms of climate. There was a movie made a number of years ago called White Oleander, and oleanders have these compounds and they're quite poisonous. Now, I mentioned cyanogenic glycosides. These, when they're damaged, release cyanide, and that blocks cellular respiration. And so cherry leaves, for example, are well known to have these. You can actually smell them if you crush certain cherry leaves. Peach plants can have it in certain of their tissues. And these, there's good evidence that they provide defense against herbivores. They're a very effective toxin. When I was a boy growing up in Virginia, there were a lot of cherry trees. And if there was a storm, we had to very carefully get any broken branches of cherry trees out of the pastures. Because when the leaves wilt, these cyanogenic glycosides release cyanide. And according to the veterinary literature, anywhere from like 1.2 to 4.8 pounds of wilted black cherry leaves could be a lethal dose for a 1,200-pound cow. So farmers were very serious about keeping fallen cherry branches away from their cattle. These things are known from over 2,500 species, and they're released when tissue is damaged, just like a cyanide booby trap. Bitter almonds, you've heard of those? 20 bitter almonds can kill a human. There are small amounts in almonds, small amounts in cherries. In a variety of things, a plant that's widely eaten in Africa is called, and in some parts of the tropics, in other parts of the world, cassava or yucca, and that can have cyanide as well. And the symptoms of cyanide poisoning, you get rapid respiration, a drop in blood pressure, headache, dizziness, vomiting, diarrhea, mental confusion, stupor. People begin to turn blue, they twitch, they go into convulsions. It's not pretty. And it's a danger to livestock. Likewise, when I was a boy, we raised cattle, beef cattle, and we would sometimes plant sorghum-related grasses. We planted something called sweet Sioux, and farmers and ranchers have to be very careful not to let cattle be exposed to these grasses under certain conditions, because the cattle can suffer and can potentially even die. I'll mention another kind of toxin, and these are alkaloids. You've all heard of alkaloids. Nicotine is an example. An alkaloid simply, chemically, it has some ring structures and it contains nitrogen. I've had some alkaloids today. I had some coffee this morning. Caffeine is an alkaloid, and I had a little dark chocolate with my lunch. That alkaloid in dark chocolate is theobromine. Theobromine. And so, we are not affected by theobromine. I don't think anybody, I've never heard of a human being injured by chocolate. You might get too much sugar, but you're not going to be damaged by the theobromine. And that's because we have special enzymes in our livers that detoxify many plant toxins. We've evolved, fortunately, to detoxify a number of plant toxins. And a number of these enzymes are called P450 enzymes. And there are a lot of different P450 enzymes. We have them, a huge number of animals have them. It turns out that caffeine and chocolate are much more toxic to dogs than to humans, because dogs and other canines have slightly different P450s, and they cannot metabolize these compounds. These are chemically, caffeine and theobromine are chemically known as xanthines. And so canines can't detoxify these. So you can literally poison a dog with chocolate. This is an article that was published a number of years ago. The title was The Evaluation of Cocoa and Coffee-Derived Methylxanthines as Toxicants for the Control of Pest Coyotes. So this is research. This was research being done trying to assess, can you use basically chocolate and coffee-derived toxins to control coyotes because these are so poisonous to canines? And the answer is yes, you can do this. Now, a fatal dose, it depends on the weight of the creature. So the weight of the dog in this case, this would literally be a death by chocolate. A fatal dose is in the range of 100 to 250 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. Now that doesn't mean much to us, but the symptoms can be rather dramatic: vomiting, staggering, agitation, seizures, even death, because the central nervous system is affected. Milk chocolate doesn't have a lot of these toxins in it. Dark chocolate does, or baking chocolate, for example. So this puts it in a little better perspective. I spent a good bit of time in the veterinary literature a few years ago looking into this. An 18-pound dog, so that's not a big dog, can be poisoned by consuming 2 ounces of baking chocolate. I think I probably had, I don't know, I may have had close to 2 ounces today, and I had dark chocolate, and I'm here talking with you tonight. And I weigh more than 18 pounds. But an 18-pound dog, could easily, if it got into some chocolate, it could get a fatal dose. Now, as I said, different animal species have slightly different P450 enzymes in their livers, but also individual humans have P450 genetic differences. So some of you in the group tonight may have a certain P450 that's very effective at breaking down caffeine, and somebody else may have P450s that are not nearly as good. And you've probably learned during the course of your life, if you have caffeine and you get real jittery and you can't sleep, you probably know that you're susceptible. Your P450 enzymes are probably a little less effective at breaking down these compounds. So different tolerances with different folks. Now I want to move on to a kind of plant defense we can call a digestibility reducer. And the example I want to use are compounds known as tannins. And there are lots and lots of plants, such as sumac, that have pretty high levels of tannin. And oaks have fairly high levels of tannins. A number of species do. And humans have learned to extract the tannins from these plants and use that to treat leather. Because if you think about it, a belt, a leather belt, or a leather pair of shoes, you're actually wearing a piece of a dead animal. Dead animals normally decompose and smell really bad. But your leather belt and your shoes don't decompose because the decomposing creatures, fungi and bacteria, can't utilize it. And if you were starving to death, it wouldn't do you any good to cut up your belt and your shoes and try to make a soup out of them, because the proteins there have been made indigestible by being tanned. And when we tan leather, we treat it with tannins, and that makes the proteins indigestible. And there are other compounds that make proteins indigestible as well. And that's a pretty effective way to protect plants, because then it just means the animals are wasting their time if they're eating those plants. So you all know that red wine can have a few tannins and tea can have a few tannins. We don't get very heavy doses from these things, and our bodies can deal with small doses. So what are these? Well, they're large molecules. They have lots of different rings, and they really have a negative impact on insects. They can damage the way insects absorb nutrients. They can cause gut lesions, and they can affect other animals as well. So this is a graphic. This is the front page of the Angus Beef Bulletin. So I have a soft spot for Angus cattle since that's what I grew up raising. And this was from in 2013, so 9 years ago. And this was an article about acorn poisoning in cattle. Acorns have large amounts of tannins. And if cattle get into a situation where there are large amounts of acorns and they don't have grass, they will actually make themselves sick or even poison themselves by overeating acorns. And their bodies can detoxify some of these tannins, but there's a limit. Native Americans in some parts of the US, particularly California, used to use acorns. Then they would grind these acorns into a meal. But what they would do, though, they would grind the acorns into a meal, and then they would pour water through this ground acorn flour, and that would leach the tannins out. So they did not ingest large amounts of tannins. In large amounts, tannins can cause, and by the way, you can get some tannins in chocolate, you can get some tannins in nuts, but it takes a large amount to cause kidney and liver damage. The good news is that we can detoxify quite a bit, but just remember, dosage. Whenever you're talking about chemicals and chemical defense, dosage means everything. If you were a Native American eating large amounts of acorn flour, they needed to detoxify that. They needed to remove those tannins. Now, I'm not going to mention a lot about the next couple of types of chemical defenses, but I think you'll find these interesting. Plants make chemicals that screw up the hormones, that disrupt the hormone system of animals. These things can mimic our own hormones. And these are known from many, many plants. This is from a paper about armyworms, and these armyworms were eating a member of the mint family, and this had something called phytoecdysones. These are plant hormones that affect metamorphosis in the insects. So insects have hormones that control their metamorphosis, changing from one life stage into the next. Well, some plants make mimics of these called phyto or plant ecdysones. And this is an abnormal pupa with 3 heads. So I think you can probably agree that an insect pupa with 3 heads probably doesn't have a very bright future. And so when I say that this affects their bodies, it can in rather dramatic ways. There are some plants that have large amounts of hormones that mimic estrogens in humans. And one of these is soy. I am very careful not to eat soy because they make something called phytoestrogens, and these phytoestrogens mimic female hormones. Some of you may have heard of, so it's sometimes recommended that menopausal women eat lots of soy because that can help with menopausal symptoms. I'm not going to say if that's true or not, but we do know that these plant hormones in members of the bean family cause reproductive problems in animals. So, for example, there are phytoestrogens in certain members of the bean family that can cause serious reproductive problems in sheep, and these problems are known from many other animals. Now, babies are sometimes given soy infant formula. I'm not a pediatrician, but I am a biologist. And knowing what I know about soy, I don't think it's probably a great idea to feed babies multiple times a day with a material that has known chemical defense compounds in it. It just doesn't make sense to me. The final category of plant chemical defense I want to mention are photosensitizers. And you know, if we were meeting in person tonight, we could all have a little, we could have some snacks, and I doubt you would have one of these. That looks like a margarita to me, and those are limes over there on the right. Now you might be wondering, why am I showing you limes and what am I talking about with photosensitizers? Well, limes happen to have a chemical that makes your skin sensitive to the sun, and this is well known. Photosensitizers are toxins that make animals sensitive to light, and these are important in plant defense. Celery, wild parsnip, both of these are examples. Some people working with large amounts of celery can develop these photosensitivities. These things are particularly known in members of the carrot family and in the citrus family. So lime is in the citrus family and celery is in the carrot family. And these compounds are called furanocoumarins, and they become light activated, and they can actually damage DNA and modify proteins in the presence of light. This is one of the molecules. You can see there are ring structures, and for chemists, that means that electrons can move about, but they can absorb energy and be activated. These are harmful to many insects. This is a thing, for example, toxicity of a furanocoumarin to armyworms. Lots and lots of insects are affected by these, and some mammals as well. We have a plant in central Texas that, if eaten, it's a member of the citrus family. It's a wild plant down in central Texas. If it is eaten by things like sheep or cattle, or if these animals come in contact with them, it can cause blistering and lesions and swelling of the head, and particularly areas without a lot of hair, exposed areas, or unpigmented skin can be damaged. This is a poor sheep that's suffering from this condition. Now, some insects have broken through the plant's defense. So, you know, evolution is like a constant battle. The plant will develop a defense, and then an insect will develop a way to get around the defense. And black swallowtails have evolved a way to get around this type of defense. They have developed, it's very interesting, a special P450 enzyme that breaks down these toxins. And the females actually pick food plants that have these toxins to lay their eggs on. And so this is a caterpillar. It's able to feed on this particular plant, even though it's toxic to most other things. So they've evolved special P450 detox enzymes. And this is a paper from many years ago. A black swallowtail has alleles, in other words, genes that can metabolize these compounds. They can break them down. You eat a relative of limes. Some people eat them in very large amounts. These are called grapefruits. These have toxins. They don't cause us to be photosensitized, but these toxins do have to be broken down by our livers. And we know now that grapefruit has adverse interactions with about 80 prescription drugs. Sometimes when you go to the drugstore, pharmacists actually put a sticker on certain medications warning you not to eat grapefruit if you're taking those drugs, because our liver enzymes are also, that's the system that breaks down prescription drugs. And if our livers can't break them down, the drugs just collect in our system. And so with certain prescription drugs, you have to be careful consuming grapefruit. I mentioned celery. There's a condition known as celery dermatitis. And this is particularly a problem if the celery is infected with a fungus, because if the celery is infected, that causes the celery plant to turn on more genes that make more of this toxin. And there's something called margarita dermatitis. All it takes is lime juice and the sun. It's well known to dermatologists. This is on the news sometimes. Here, for example, is a thing from ABC News: limes blamed for girls' second-degree burns. And I had a good friend once who developed very serious Lyme dermatitis on her hands because she made some limeade and went outside and gardened. And she didn't know what had caused it. And she went to various doctors. And finally, somebody figured out she had this type of Lyme-induced dermatitis. But her hands swelled up. They were very red, very painful. It lasted for days. She really suffered, just as this poor little girl looks like she suffered. Now, I just want to mention in my last few slides a few additional kinds of chemical defense. A few additional kinds of defense. I don't really consider this one a type of chemical defense since it works in a whole different way, but you could say it's chemical defense. This is called semiochemicals, where the plant sends out signals to creatures telling them, come here, there's something here you're going to want to see. So let's talk about how this works. Some caterpillars damage plants. Caterpillars will be eating on a plant. The plant will send out a chemical, and that attracts a certain kind of wasp that attacks these caterpillars. So the plants are calling in the cavalry. The plants are calling in the wasp to attack the caterpillars that are trying to eat them. Now, that's a pretty sophisticated type of defense mechanism. So we call these semiochemicals. Some of you may have heard of a word called semaphore. That's a word that was used. I think semaphore was some type of flagging that they used to use in navies. But the word semio indicates a signal. So these semio are signaling chemicals. And this is a wasp attacking a caterpillar. And it's actually probably using its ovipositor to lay eggs in that caterpillar's body. And you can see this caterpillar has all kinds of parasitic wasp cocoons on its body. And that caterpillar is a goner. These things are literally have eaten it from the inside. There's another fascinating kind of defense, and that's where plants have armed guards. You could call this animal guard defense, if you will. The plants have what are called extrafloral nectaries. These are nectar-producing structures that are not part of a flower. And you can see ants on this leaf, and they're coming to certain parts of the leaf where it's oozing sweet liquid, in other words, nectar. And there's a plant called the bullhorn acacia. Ants live in the thorns of this acacia plant. You can see these big thorns. There are different species, have different shaped thorns. Ants live in those thorns. The plant also has at the ends of their little leaflets, they have little food bodies that the ants harvest and eat. And this plant also has these special glands. You can see this ant right at one. You can see these ants up here in the upper left feeding. These ants are licking up nectar. So the plant makes two kinds of food, a solid food and a liquid food, and it provides a home for these ants. These ants actually live in and on that plant and attack any other insect that tries to harm that plant. These are literally armed guards, and they will come out and attempt to bite and sting creatures that fool with it. And I've seen these many, many times in the tropics. And some of the world's leading ant experts, including a guy, E.O. Wilson, indicated that nearly 100 different genera of plants in the tropics have such an ant defense mechanism. It's very, very common. And we have one plant in East Texas, the bracken fern, that has these special nectar glands. Now I'm going to mention two final kinds of defense, and these are both weird, but I think you'll understand them. They're easy to understand. This is up here in the upper left corner, you see this leaf, that's from a greenbrier, and the leaf looks like it's diseased. But as all of you guys know from walking around in the woods in north central Texas, that's normal. And then here's another plant that looks like it has diseased leaves. Well, and the passion flower, this is a passion flower, the leaves of that flower have some weird things. So these plants look like they're diseased, they're defending themselves visually. The passion flower has all kinds of weird leaf shapes, and these leaf shapes mimic the leaves of certain poisonous plants in some cases. And sometimes these passion flowers have what are called egg mimics. You see these little dots? That makes butterflies think that something else has already laid an egg on there. And so butterflies will pass on by and not lay eggs, which would then hatch and cause leaf damage. So these leaves have some type of visual thing that protects them. So that's called visual defense. And this is one of our native greenbriers, Smilax bonanox, and you can see that leaf looks sick. The leaf is not sick. It just has these weird color patterns. And finally, escape in time. Now you might be thinking, okay, George, these don't look like plants. And indeed they're not. These are wildebeest. They are creatures that live on the African savanna. But I'm going to use them as an example, and because I think that's the best way to explain it. And then I'm going to tell you about one of our well-known native plants that does something similar. These wildebeest are fascinating. They're present in giant herds. And the female, and these, you've seen them on the nature shows, they're in amazingly large herds. And the females all have their babies in about a 2-week period. Now you think, that's weird. If you put that in human terms, that's like all pregnant women giving birth in the first 2 weeks of September. It'd be strange, wouldn't it? But that's the way wildebeest work. And we think the reason is these wildebeest babies are really good at getting up and being able to run in about 20 minutes. But for the first few days, they can't run real fast. And so they're like sitting ducks for lions and other predators. But you give them just a little while and they're tough to catch. And so it's thought that the wildebeest have evolved to have all their babies in a very short period of time because the predators can only eat so many during this very limited time window. And the rest of the year, most of the wildebeest can get away. Now, think about that in terms of plants or animals. There is an animal in the eastern US called the 17-year cicada. They were around where I grew up. We don't have the 17-year cicada right here, but we have some other cicadas, and you've all seen them probably. The 17-year cicada has done kind of the same thing. They live underground, feeding on the roots of plants for 17 years. And then they're only present 1 year, one summer, every 17 years. And so they have figured out, they've evolved a way to escape being eaten by creatures, because no bird is going to evolve to specialize in eating cicadas. Now, how about in terms of plants? Well, our state tree, the pecan. If anybody has a pecan tree, you know that some year you'll have a huge crop. We call it mass fruiting. You'll have a huge crop, and then it might be a year or 2 or 3 before you have another big crop. And you can't predict it. It's kind of irregular. And the thinking is that pecans have evolved a way to not being present every year, because that way an insect species can't build up large populations and damage too much of it. So I've been going on now for about 50 minutes. I'm going to stop and jump out of my slide share. And if there's time, I would be delighted to attempt. I can't guarantee I can answer questions, but I'll sure try.
And this is where I come in, huh? So any
Right.
questions? Speak up or type on the side there. What about sensitive briar? Is that a defense?
I think that is a defense. I have thought about that a lot. It's not totally clear to me how it works, but I think for certain herbivores, when the sensitive briar closes up, that probably does make it less of a target. And for some of you who know the introduced plant called mimosa, the tree with the pink blossoms, that closes up at night. And it doesn't need to have its leaflets exposed during the day. And so that may be a way it's protecting itself from creatures that would be feeding on it at night. So that's a great question. Bill, that was your question? That's a good question. Who else has a question?
Do you have a good book that you would recommend?
On plant defense?
Yes.
There are a number of books on poisonous plants. There's one huge one that has about toxic plants of North America, I think it's called. You can look it up on Amazon. Ron Turl, it's either T-R-Y-L or T-Y-R-L. He's one of the two authors. That is of all the poisonous plants in North America, and one of the authors is a veterinarian, one is a botanist. So if you want to really get into real detail, you could look at that. I don't know of a good just kind of coffee table book for poisonous plants.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Kim was asking, what about what plant is causing the sheepskin problems?
That is Thamnosa. It's a little member of the citrus family. It's a little shrubby thing. We don't have it up here. We have a plant here that is related to it, but it's called tickle tongue. Have some of y'all seen that? It's got spines coming out of the trunk, and it's got it's called tickle tongue because if you chew on it, your tongue goes numb, and it has some toxins in it. But this little plant in Central Texas is Thamnosa, and it's in the citrus family. So if you Google, I can't remember the exact spelling of it, Thamnosma, something like that. Central Texas, you'll probably find it on Google. But it's pretty serious, and it can really mess animals up if they eat it.
The older one, people are adding new ones, and then I can't find my list here. The toxicity of nankinberries.
I don't know what nankinberry is. I'm sorry. It's
I'm sorry, that's my question. I missed a typo. Nandina.
Nandina. That's a great question. I don't know what the toxin in Nandina is. Sorry. Just don't know. And I see somebody says you touched on cattle and acorns and how dangerous acorns are to them. Cattle can certainly eat some acorns, deer and wild pigs, a variety of, acorns are important food for wild pigs in some part of the world. For example, Spain, that's important, but different creatures do have different abilities to break down certain toxins. One of the best examples that I can give for that off the top of my head you've all heard about the koalas in Australia, and they eat basically eucalyptus leaves. And in fact, I spent a lot of time in Australia on a sabbatical once. I got to hold a koala. They reek of eucalyptus because that's almost the only thing they eat. And they must have the best detox system going because, you know, if we ate those eucalyptus leaves, we'd be sick as we could be. And in fact, almost any other animal, but they have evolved a way to detoxify that. So different creatures definitely can detox different things. Some things that are very poisonous to us, certain animals can eat with impunity. You know, like animals eat, some of the wild animals around here eat the fruits of poison ivy. Doesn't hurt them a bit. If you ate poison ivy, some percentage of you would really regret it.
Yes.
We all laugh here.
Let's see, I'm looking to see what else in the comments.
What is that?
Is that, yeah, the Xanthoxylum hirsutum is the scientific name for the tickle tongue. And I've got one growing out behind my house, and when I take students on field trips, I'd get them to take a leaflet and put it on their tongue and chew it, and your tongue goes numb. In fact, I did it so much one day I started lisping. I couldn't talk properly because the end of my tongue was so numb. And the Indians used to use it as a toothache medication. So it's sometimes called toothache tree.
Mhm. It's not poisonous, well, numbs, but
Well, yeah, I've never heard of anybody being injured by it, but I certainly, when I would have students taste it, and I would, you know, I'd never have them do anything that I wouldn't do first, but I would do it. And I'd tell them, do this and then spit it out. I don't think it would be good to eat. So there's one here. What is the poison in pokeweed? That's a great question. I don't remember the specific name, but some of the toxins in pokeweeds are classified as mitogens. They can affect cell division. And so pokeweed, you know, some people eat the immature leaves and they cook them certain ways, but I would not have my students even touch a pokeweed plant because, you know, anything that screws with cell division is probably not a good thing. If you have access, you can go online and look up the Illustrated Flora of North Central Texas. It's available online, and there's a little write-up in there about pokeweed and the poison in pokeweed. Let's see, looking for other, let's see, Rachel put up symptoms of Nandina poisoning in dogs, and Nandina berries kill birds. Yeah, it's real unfortunate some of the introduced plants are hard on native creatures. And here's one mentioned about cedar waxwing toxicity. Interesting. Any other questions or comments?
what was that website, you illustrated guide, or is that in on the
So-
computer?
One of the books that I co-authored is called The Illustrated Flora of North Central Texas. And some of the folks in this group know that book well. And it's available online in PDF form, free of charge. And, you know, you can just, it's on the Brit website. You can find it. I don't have the URL in front of me, but Jim, I know that some of the other members of your group can tell you how to get to that. It's but it's available online. We didn't want to, you know, we wanted so it could be up there so people wouldn't have to buy it if they just want to check something.